everyone. Welcome to the Preemie Chats, and thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm Fabiana Bacchini, Executive Director of the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, or CPBF. We are a charitable organization, and our mission is to empower families of premature babies through support and education. This Preemie Chat series is one of the many initiatives we have to bring information for NICU families and healthcare professionals. Here every Friday, we talk with experts, researchers, and parents who share with us their experience and knowledge. Also on our website, canadianpreemies.org, parents will find all kinds of resources and support. And today we're going to talk about parenthood. Our current societal definition of parenthood is filled with ideals and unrealistic expectations. During this session, we'll talk about unlearning what we have internalized about what it means to be a good parent. We'll chat about rewriting the narrative on parenting and normalizing some of the harder aspects of being a parent. We'll also discuss redefining what it means to care for ourselves during these challenging times and why we need to relook at our definitions of self-care. And I have here joining us live from York Region in Toronto, Kelly Hassanpour, who is a registered nurse in Ontario. She has worked throughout her career with infants and their families in the neonatal intensive care units in the Greater Toronto area. She's also the founder of Parenting from Within, a safe space of support for parents and parents-to-be. Parenting from Within offers prenatal education, parent and baby groups, and workshops. Kelly's work and personal experience have led her to be an advocate for infant and maternal mental health. Kelly holds a Master of Science in Nursing from York University, a certification for neonatal intensive care nursing, and she's also a certified childbirth educator and a certified in perinatal mental health. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us here today. This is such an important topic, and you're already chatting a little bit ways to be a parent.
Yes, well, thank you so much for having me on today, and thank you for the work that you are doing. This is such an amazing space for parents and healthcare professionals.
Thank you. And for all of you watching us live, please do send your comments, your insights, and we're going to address them at the end of Kelly's presentation. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Thank you. All right. So I, as Fabiana mentioned, started parenting from within just this past year, really. And it was really born out of my own experience of becoming a parent. And as she mentioned, before I had my own son, almost 4.5 years ago now to the day, I worked in NICUs across the GTA. And during that time, I thought, as I was leading up to having my baby, I thought like, oh, no problem. I've got this. Like I've worked for over 10 years with infants and families. And, once I had him and he entered this world and I became a mom, I realized two things. One, how cute of an idea that was that I had. And two is that, before my son was born, I had this expectation of what being a mom was going to be. And this picture in my head, and a lot of it was based on what I'd seen in TVs and movies, and just a lot of what had been ingrained in me throughout my life. And as I was a few months into parenthood myself, I realized just how unrealistic these expectations are that we have of parents, and I would say especially primary caregivers, which is oftentimes mom. And I know for myself, I really felt that. But I also felt like there was such a silence around it, and it often felt like I was the only one experiencing this. And so for me, it is really important to open up the conversation about, yes, parenthood is wonderful and there's amazing moments, but there's also really challenging moments too. And just because we find some aspects hard doesn't mean there's anything wrong with us or that we're a bad parent. It just means that this is a hard experience to have. And so really, when we look at this picture and we talk to the parents who are out there of like, what does it mean to be like a good parent or a good mom, or a good primary caregiver? A lot of the things that come up are things like a good parent is self-sacrificing. And I always give the example of, it drives me a little bit crazy when you're approaching Mother's Day and let's say there's like a radio morning show having a competition or a contest of doing giveaways for moms, and you're supposed to write in and say why your mom deserves whatever it is that the prize is. And always the winners, the story includes things like, my mom never did anything for herself. My mom never took care of herself. She always put us first. And so this this idea of like parent as martyr, or like this self-sacrificing parent, has really been what has been put kind of up on a pedestal of what it means to be a good parent. And I think it's time that we opened up that narrative a little bit and looked at, well, what does that mean for that parent, and the effects that is having on them. We often find that like parenthood becomes all encompassing, and that there's really a loss of identity, which is true, because when you have this new parenthood part that comes in, it takes a lot of work to be able to kind of integrate that into the rest of our being. But there's really challenges around trying to keep it from becoming the all-encompassing part, and remembering what all we were before we became a parent as well. There's so many unrealistic expectations around physical recovery. We see that both, portrayed in the media and social media. I remember as a kid standing in the grocery store lineup and seeing the tabloid that was like, whatever celebrity has their 6-pack abs back in 6 weeks, which is obviously not only not realistic, but also potentially quite dangerous as well for your physical recovery. But I think we also see these unrealistic expectations really centered around our healthcare system as well. And, we see so much of, there's so many appointments while you're pregnant with the baby. And then the baby is born. And if you delivered with an obstetrician, you are often going 6 weeks before anybody really checks in on you, which is just crazy to me. But it really sort of reinforces that narrative of, you are not important anymore. Your needs no longer matter. And then we really have in North America this ideal of like, you can do it all, and the super mom and the super parent. And not only can you do it all, but you can do it without any help, which is completely unrealistic. There is a reason why we say it takes a village. But we really have moved away from that village mentality. And in terms of like the definitions of like, what does it mean to be a good parent and all these unrealistic expectations, this is just a very short list. But other things that we hear all the time in our groups is like, to fit that quote unquote good parent ideal, it's like, you didn't need any help bringing your baby into this world. You had a natural birth, whatever that means. Breastfeeding was easy. Your baby sleeps through the night. Nothing changes in your relationship between you and your partner. And another big one is that you love your baby right from that very moment. And you have this movie moment when they put the baby on your chest, if that's your experience, that you got to have the baby on your chest. And you fall instantly in love. And we know that happens for some people, but it doesn't happen for everybody, and it doesn't happen for a lot of people. And so it's just one of those messages that we've seen over and over again. And so when that moment doesn't happen, instead of talking about it, a lot of parents are left with this feeling of like, well, I think everybody else feels that way. Why don't I feel that way? And that is oftentimes that like first thought of like, I'm a bad parent. And so when we talk about like, where does this actually all come from? It's important to remember that we have been internalizing what it means to be a good parent from the time we were very little ourselves, and being parented ourselves. And so we know that out there in media, if you've watched a movie or a TV show, even like the whole labor scene is often very unrealistic, where, the person's water breaks and they rush off to the hospital, where we know that is not the experience for a lot of people, and for most people, right through to, you watch TV shows where the main character has a baby. It's like one episode, and then the baby really never plays a big part in the show from there on in. So it just reinforces that idea of like having a baby is easy. But then again, we have been, and most of these messages have been coming at us since we were very, very little. And we maybe have been looking at our own parents who perhaps, parented us in a way in which, we felt like we had good parents. But if we look back at our mom, for example, who, yes, I would absolutely say my own mom put us first, took care of us first. And now when I think back on it, and I think, that's what I held to be ideal myself as when I became a mom, and just how challenging that is when we don't take care of ourselves at the same time. Or, in the opposite direction of if you had parents who maybe weren't what you needed growing up, you have this picture now of, those are very early messages of maybe what it meant to not be a great parent. And now you're kind of swinging in the opposite direction. So it's just really important to realize like these messages have been ingrained in you for a really, really long time. And because of that, they can be really hard to let go of. And we even know there's literature around this very idea of like trying to let go of this idea of being the perfect parent. And that although we can objectively recognize that these expectations or this narrative that's been put out there is unrealistic, it's so ingrained in us that we are still left with a lot of the effects of it. And so when we are not meeting these expectations that have been put out there, you're going to love every minute of it. You can end up feeling grief, which is a normal part of parenthood. Having a baby is a huge transition in your life. It's probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest change that's going to happen in your life. And so with every big change comes this sense of grief for what was before. And so especially during that baby blues period, let's say, it's really normal to have some thoughts of like, what have we done? Really missing that freedom you maybe had before you had a baby. But again, we don't talk about these feelings very often. We instead have this expectation that we're going to love every moment of it. So when we have these feelings, they can be really hard to deal with. It's really common to feel some resentment, especially towards partners. We see that a lot. And again, especially if we can't talk about it and we're trying to live up to this ideal of like, well, I have to do it all and I have to do it myself and I can't ask for help. It's really common for resentment to enter into the relationship where you maybe feel like your partner has a little bit more freedom than you do, or, you are the one solely responsible for feeding your baby. So again, just a little bit of resentment towards that. What goes along with that is some anger of like, why can't either anger at yourself for why can't I meet these expectations? Everybody else seems to be doing it. Or anger at others as well, having a shorter fuse than you used to have. Sleep deprivation definitely plays a part into that as well. And then one of the biggest feelings of all of this is shame. And, not getting caught in this spiral of like wanting to be a perfect parent and comparing ourselves to social media images that we see can really just throw us into like a shame spiral where we're feeling like we're a bad parent, we're a bad person. But really, it's not that you're any of those things. You have been thrown into an impossible situation, an impossible parenting culture. Really. And then we can see struggles with mood. So perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. For myself personally, I had postpartum anxiety, and I would for sure say that a lot of these unrealistic expectations and trying to meet those expectations played a big part in it, because I felt like I couldn't ask for help because, everybody else seemed to be able to do it. Why couldn't I? So one thing I love this saying of like, are you shoulding all over yourself? And so we often like to say that should is really like a shaming word. And so we're going to talk about it in the next slide about like, so how can we tackle these unrealistic expectations? What can we do to help ourselves? And one of the first things is just recognizing that it's happening. And recognizing that maybe there's some external influences playing into your thoughts at that time. And so one example I like to give is, my baby's just gone down for a nap. And, I was scrolling through social media and I saw this post about how important sensory bins are for your baby's development. And so as your baby is napping and maybe you finally just sat down for the first time that day, and then these thoughts start to roll in through your head of like, well, I should be putting a sensory bin together. And so anytime I say to parents, if you're starting to have these should thoughts, is to like take a moment and stop and think about, okay, what are actually your values here? What do you value as a parent? Do you actually want to put a sensory bin together, or were you just influenced by this social media post that was most likely trying to sell you a sensory bin? Um, because if that's what it is, then no, you don't have to do it. If you think, yeah, like I love putting sensory bins together and it's a great way for me and my baby to play, then absolutely go for it. But if you were sitting there thinking like, well, I'd really like to have a little rest right now, but I should be putting a sensory bin together. That's kind of like step one of trying to combat these unrealistic expectations, just simply recognizing that it's happening. The second is like, let's normalize these challenging feelings in parenting. Those feelings are hard to have, and we live in a culture of toxic positivity. So it's really hard for people to sit and hold space for that for you. And so oftentimes when we try to say to, a friend, like, I'm having a really hard day, you're often met with like, oh, well, at least be thankful you have a baby because my friend has been suffering from infertility for years. Or, just a lot of those like, at least. And so that is not usually helpful. And it just like continues that shame spiral of like, well, I shouldn't be having these feelings. So if we can, talk about these feelings, these challenging feelings, the grief, the resentment, the anger, some sadness, all of those are totally normal feelings to have, but it's really like, it's these thoughts that we're having about our thoughts that are really hard to deal with. And so another thing I love is self-compassion. And so that is really the difference between, I'm having a really hard day. My baby's been screaming. And instead of thinking like, I must be doing something wrong. Why can't I get my baby to stop crying? Instead, just like taking a pause, taking a moment to be like, wow, this is really hard. I'm feeling really overwhelmed right now because this is a really hard moment. And so that can really just kind of alleviate or take it a little bit more externally of like, this is a hard moment, as opposed to like internalizing this difficulty and feeling like you're doing something wrong. And so in terms of that, and in terms of normalizing challenging feelings, I really like to talk about like parenthood sort of in terms of a marathon. So, if you are going to run a marathon, you train and you train and you train. And during that training, someone will often say to you, at like mile 22 or whatever, having never run a marathon, somebody will say to you, that was really, really hard for me. Like I had a really hard time. I felt like I hit a wall, but I was able to push through it and I finished. So that when you hit mile 22 and you have a really challenging time and you're thinking about quitting, you can say, okay, this is that really hard moment they were talking about. I get it. I just need to, I can push through. It's just a moment and I'm going to get through it. Whereas in parenthood, when we don't talk about these challenging feelings, instead of feeling like, oh, okay, this is the part my sister was talking about when she had her baby, that this is a really hard moment. Instead of thinking like, oh, this is the hard moment, we often think like, oh my gosh, what's wrong with me? Like, why is this so hard? And so the final thing I think we can do about challenging these unrealistic expectations is really redefining what it means, what self-care means. And I encompass building a village within that self-care. And so for me, redefining self-care, I know Fabiana and I have spoken previously about how neither one of us really likes the term self-care. And I think that is because we have really our definition of self-care has become like either we're going to go get our hair and nails done or we're going to have a shower. And really like neither one of those things is actually self-care. One is just like a basic necessity of life. And one is that you can go out and maybe it'll make you feel good for a little bit, but it really doesn't mean self-care. And so I think two of the most important things when it comes to self-care, and I think this is one is just like taking a moment of like getting some coping skills in place. So in these challenging moments, and this can be for any parent, whether you're, your babe's still in the NICU, if you've come home, if your baby came home with you right away, is just like, okay, how can I'm feeling really overwhelmed right now. I'm feeling, for whatever reason, is how can I calm my nervous system right now? So can I splash some water on my face? Because that's actually going to activate our vagus nerve, which is going to help to calm us down a little bit. Do I know that moving my body really calms me down? So can I go for a walk? Because that's wonderful, because you can move your body and nature also helps. But if it's like a really rainy, crummy day and you can't get outside with your baby, maybe you need to do like 10 jumping jacks just to like help move your body a little bit. Even simple things like humming can actually, again, activate your vagus nerve and help to calm you down. So, even working with a therapist is a wonderful way. Going into the how to build your village is a wonderful person to add to your village of how can you, if you're feeling really overwhelmed a lot of the time, what sort of coping strategies can you put in place, even if it's just as simple as some deep breathing to be able to calm your nervous system. And so finally is this whole build a village thing. And yes, it's cliche and we say it all the time, but it's true. And like I said, we've moved so far away from our village here in North America that, again, it can feel shaming when you're trying to find one. And also, if you have the means to do so, you can outsource and get help from and pay for some help. So, you have one thing I like to say either in our prenatal classes or even when you've had a baby is like, when you're having a calm moment, think about all the people you have in your life who can help you at times and write it down and have that list on your fridge. So like, do you have a neighbor you can call to walk the dog if like life is just completely out of control in your house? Do you have a friend who you can phone and talk to and they'll just hold space for your feelings as opposed to trying to solve your problem or at leasting it? Put these names on your fridge, because when you are in the heat of feeling overwhelmed, you're not going to be able to remember who these people are. But if you have it on your fridge, you can be like, I know that, Aunt Sally, who lives 3 blocks away, would be more than happy to bring us dinner tonight. So I'm going to give her a call. And so that is what I mean by building a village. And then also finding your support out there. So do you need a therapist? Lots of us do. And there's no shame in that. I think that should be just standard of care after becoming a parent, is having an appointment with a therapist. But also look at like Canadian, at these Preemie Chats. They're absolutely wonderful. This is an amazing village to have in the whole organization. And there's lots of other organizations out there as well who do peer support, as do Canadian Preemies. But, doing peer support, therapy, or finding a support group for parents who've been in the NICU. All of those are amazing ways to find your village, to normalize what you're going through and to help develop some coping strategies. So I honestly think that the greatest gift we can give another parent is to be honest about our own parenting experiences. And so that just goes back to normalizing all of these feelings and the hard parts, and having open and honest conversations about them. So that's really it. That is just my short little spiel. I could talk forever really about all of these unrealistic expectations, but here's a brief little overview.
Wow, Kelly, thank you. You nail every single point. I was like, okay, I done that, felt that, was raised like that. It's amazing, because sometimes you feel so lonely on this journey and feeling those feelings of like, oh my God, I'm very, I'm not a good parent because I have all these feelings. But when you actually talk about it, it's like, yes, we're not alone. Right.
No.
And I think coming out of the NICU, I think a lot of those things are exacerbated because of the experience.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And I think the thing is, and like you said, we don't talk about it, and we don't I'm going to speak as like from my own self, but as a bedside NICU nurse, I never prepared any parent for those feelings going home at all.
Yeah. And I think, the NICU is so intense. There's so much happening now there. And we think about, okay, there's a lot of value and peer support in that situation, because then parents can validate each other's feelings. And I feel like you did mention the village, you did talk about groups. And this is something else that you also do in your parenting from within. Talk a little bit about the peer piece, because I think this is so important for families, especially families who have experienced trauma.
Sure. So myself and a therapist, Christine Cunningham, will be starting up an NICU support group in September. So it'll be a 6-week program. And we are going to, our goals are really to, normalize your experience coming out of the NICU, validate your feelings. We're going to talk about perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. Anxiety is usually a big piece. Intrusive thoughts are something that don't get spoken about very often, but we know that 100% of parents experience intrusive thoughts. So really those like flashes and that heightened awareness you might be having, which is very common after having a baby in the NICU. We're going to talk about trauma and then come up with some coping techniques for all of that as well. So that will be, it's virtual, is open to anybody in Ontario because we're both licensed in Ontario. But I also just wanted to mention too, there's another organization that Christine, who I'm running it with, runs, which is Perinatal Wellbeing Ontario. And they also offer individual peer support and group peer support at no cost. And I do know they have at least one peer support trained who has NICU experience.
Yeah, this is so important for families. I want to go back to the beginning when you're talking about self-sacrifice and the loss of identity, physical recovery, because you nail all the points there about the new parents, especially new parents when you're just had a baby. But I really want to talk about the physical recovery because this is something that we don't talk about that in Canada at all. I've been here for 20 years. I'm a mom for 13, but I have not seen those conversations. And the recovery piece, when you talk about it, you go to see your obstetrician 6 weeks after you deliver, which is, yes, we don't take care of ourselves. So how can we change that piece of that culture that parents, yes, we do need to take care of especially the mom, the birthing parent that went through either a C-section or a vaginal delivery. That's not always an easy delivery. So how do you feel that we could change that conversation and that culture? Yes, we need to be seen. We need to take care of ourselves.
Yeah. So I think like if you're talking big picture, the whole like postpartum care world needs to be completely overhauled. Like, in my opinion, everybody should have an appointment with a pelvic floor physiotherapist. Most people don't even know what a pelvic floor physiotherapist is, let alone have an appointment with them. But that is a standard of care in France. I think everybody should have like an appointment with a therapist, like I talked about. Even if you didn't have a quote unquote traumatic delivery, you still underwent a ginormous change, and there's going to be huge things for you to process in terms of your identity and your relationship. You know, like support with a lactation consultant would be amazing too. Obviously, these are all like dreaming big situations where we overhaul the entire postpartum world. But I think like from today's perspective of what you can do is, one, talk about your experiences. If we're talking about like physical injury during birth, like most people don't talk about that. And most people, if you gave birth vaginally, experienced a tear. But it is not something we talk about. So again, most people are left to feel completely alone in that situation. Two is like educate yourself about who is your village out there? Who can you go to? So people like a pelvic floor physiotherapist who really ideally you should see before and after you have a baby. Chiropractors can do a lot for pain. Massage therapists can do a lot for pain. So is just finding out what resources are there out there for you. But the third thing is like, it's like a mind shift of like, you deserve to be cared for too. And the unfortunate thing is when you're talking about the like healthcare system, I know so many women who have gone to their GP, let's say, and said, I either have bladder leakage happening, or I still having like pain, lower back pain, a year after having a baby. And instead of them investigating it or looking into it or giving you resources, the answer is often like, oh, that's normal. You had a baby. And so to realize there is a difference between like what is common and what is normal. Like bladder leakage is very common after having a baby, but it's not quote unquote normal. And there are resources like a pelvic floor physiotherapist out there who can work with you. But so often it's just like brushed aside of like, well, that's just the way it is.
It is very true. And we have to keep in mind that the way we feel physically is going to affect our mental health. It's going to affect the parents, the way we cope with the new challenges that are ahead of us. So I feel that, yes, we don't talk about it, especially among us women, like why we're so embarrassed to talk about things that are so normal that happen to our bodies after you have the baby.
Exactly.
We have no problems talking about breastfeeding. I'm breastfeeding my baby. But the challenges that come with all of this is totally overlooked because, okay, your body should be able to do that naturally.
Yeah, exactly. And it comes back to that shame piece sort of, right? Of like, well, I must have done something wrong. Like if this is still happening. The other thing I like to remind people too is you can bring your baby to your appointments. A lot of people get very stressed about like, well, what am I going to do with the baby? I don't have anybody to look after them. And like most of the supports that are out there who work with postpartum parents are totally happy for your baby to come with you.
That's a great point. Kelly, the other thing I want to talk to you about is the mental health, because you mentioned on your presentation a little bit of the baby blues. Yeah. And we know many people experience the baby blues, but when is the baby blues, and then when is the time to get help for a mental issue? Because I think there's also a lot of stigma there. There is also a lot of misunderstanding, misconceptions of how mental health should look like. Yeah. So, let's talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So I will absolutely say there is no education out there in terms of perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, or very little. I never had a healthcare practitioner speak to me about it personally. And I was diagnosed with postpartum anxiety at 13 months, like when my son was 13 months, because I didn't recognize it in myself until then. And so I often think of like, if I, as a nurse and a nurse who worked with new moms all the time, didn't recognize it, how is the average person supposed to recognize it? And I think it's also important to acknowledge that there is no strategy out there for, like, there is no national or provincial strategy for screening for perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, for treating it. So it really is an individual basis. So baby blues happens in 80% of people. So it's a pretty high number. And it really, what's happening is it happens usually within the first 48 hours after birth, it'll kind of kick in. And it can last up to 2 weeks. And for me personally, I called it like I was feeling all the feels. Like I had so many feelings. And it's really, your hormones are taking a giant plummet. So estrogen and progesterone, which is what kept your pregnancy going, drops dramatically in that period, which is the same thing sort of like what happens during PMS. So it's really common to be very weepy, very like crying for no reason, sweating a lot, which a lot of people are not prepared for. And just like, and having some feelings of like, oh my gosh, what did we do? Because you're adjusting to that whole world. But if those feelings start to last beyond 2 weeks, that's when I would be starting to get concerned that there's something more going on. And then if you're talking about in terms of perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, a lot of people think that postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, postpartum OCD, postpartum psychosis, people expect those to happen sort of really quickly after the baby is born. But symptoms can actually start to show up from the time of conception. And then they say technically all the way through to 12 months. But I would say, and a lot of people say like well beyond that is the postpartum period. And so that is kind of different symptoms for different things. But the one big red flag you can watch out for, and oftentimes it's not you who will recognize it, is somebody who says, I don't feel like myself. Mm-hmm. And so if things are really starting, if you're talking about anxiety, the like constant worrying, the constant tension, the constant feeling like something bad is going to happen, you're really looking at some anxiety there. And is it starting to interfere with your life? So an example that's often given is like, I'm afraid I'm at the top of the stairs and I get worried about dropping the baby down the stairs. That's an intrusive thought, which is very normal, but it's there to serve a purpose to say, hey, be careful. You don't want to drop your baby down the stairs. So it does serve a purpose. So now I hug my baby a little closer. I hold onto the railing and I walk down the stairs and I move about my day. That's an intrusive thought to have, but the anxiety didn't take over. Mm-hmm. But if you are now at the point of like, either like, I'm going to like sit on the stairs and kind of bum scoot down with my baby because I'm afraid I'm going to fall down, or I'm just not going to go up and down the stairs anymore, it's now really impacting your life. Mm-hmm. And probably you should seek some seek some support there. Same with depression. It's really like if you can no longer see the joy in anything. And some of these are really hard because a lot of it just comes with sleep deprivation. So I often like to look at it as in like, is it really now impacting your quality of life? Or are your coping strategies that you have not keeping up with the thoughts that you're having or the feelings that you're having? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, and I think you illustrated really well what is normal or what is a time to look for help, because I think, yes, we all, like many of us, have intrusive thoughts every now and then, but when that stops you or prevent you from doing something, I think you illustrated that greatly. Kelly, one more question for you about self-care before we wrap it up, because next week is self-care.
Yes, I saw that.
You did say that we don't like this word, and I really, I really don't. And but it's something that it's so important for us to take care of ourselves. You gave great examples of self-care, but I really, and sometimes when you're so busy living life and taking care of the child, or back to work, or whatever you need to do, it's like, how do you put all that aside? It's okay, this is my me time. And I have to tell you, one time when I was so exhausted because my son didn't sleep through the night until he was 4. I woke up every hour.
I feel you on that one.
Looking back, I don't know how I did it, but I remember when I was getting out of that phase, and he had diagnosis of cerebral palsy, and I was overwhelmed with appointments. And I had a mentor, and she said to me, every Friday is your me time. Okay, I can do from 1 to 3 every Friday. So I organized my life in a way that I could take that time off for me. But what really helped me is that she held me accountable. I had to email her every Friday at 5 o'clock to tell her what I did on my me time.
I think she like held you accountable, but it also like she gave you permission to say it's okay for you to take these 2 hours, right? We talk about it a lot with like going out for dinner with a friend kind of thing, right? And that like mom quote unquote guilt that can set in of like, oh, I shouldn't be going. There's that should again. Like, oh, I should just stay home. And a lot of that becomes down to like, oh, because I should spend every moment with my baby and I should love every moment of it. But I'm like, but if you stay home and now know that you have a few friends who are out for dinner, you're probably going to be a little angry and a little resentful that happened. Or yes, it takes some, there's a mental load piece there for sure about preparing to go out without baby and leaving baby with your partner or whoever it will may be. But hopefully you can go out, have some time to just like refresh a little bit, and hopefully maybe even remind yourself a little bit of who you were before you became a parent. And then hopefully you go home and you feel refreshed, and then therefore you will be quote unquote a better parent because you've had a little break. You can now come back and like, absence makes the heart grow fonder, right? Is the saying. And now you come back and you're happy to see your baby maybe. And so it's kind of like, well, am I going to stay home and be angry and resentful that I didn't get to go? Or can I put that kind of load up front and then go and hopefully have a little break and be refreshed?
It's so important to recharge, right? For so long, especially moms, run on empty because you have, you feel that we have to do it all and do it all alone, which is so hard. Right. So that moment of recharge, it's so important. And I remember like before the pandemic, I spent 1 year, I was traveling a lot for work. And some of my friends said, don't you feel guilty to leave your children? I said, actually, I don't, because it's the time for me, even though it's for work, it was a time for me to be alone in a hotel at night and decompress and watch a movie without having to serve anybody. And that made me wonder. So now it's like, okay, I've been 3 years almost in the pandemic without having that opportunity. And I think we're all feeling that burn right now as parents.
Yeah. And you can take baby steps, right? With that of like, because sometimes you need to practice it. So can I say like to my partner, I want to go for a walk around the block by myself. Like I'll be gone for 10 minutes. Let's just see how this goes. But I think, again, it's like asking, it's feeling the need to ask that you can do it and having someone give you permission to do it, where to just kind of, if you could try to internalize that you deserve that break too.
Kelly, you have so much work to do. With ourselves and as a society in general, right? Because as you mentioned, I come from a country where we all have help at home.
Yeah.
I come from Brazil. It's a family, it's the neighbors. We have this more community feel.
Yeah.
Here, as you mentioned, North America, we are so isolated and we don't seek help, and we feel that we need to do it all, which is very damaging. And I think for all parents out there, my kids are 10 and 13, and it doesn't end.
Yeah.
Like, that's why it is a marathon, and it's going to go on for a long time. When you have it to one time stop and say, I am important too.
Exactly. And believing it.
Exactly that. Okay, Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today. It was lovely talking to you, and I'm looking
forward for having me.
More about your program in the fall, and really let the families here, CPBF, know that we have that service in Ontario now.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And to all of you watching us live today, thank you so much for joining today. And if you missed any of our past videos, we can watch on our website, which is, let me share the link here, the canadianpreemies.org, or on our YouTube channel. And I want to thank our sponsor, AstraZeneca, for the ongoing support of our educational sessions. And we are a charitable organization, and we believe that through support and education, we can empower families, ensuring they are ready to care for their babies. Please visit our website, consider making a donation. Together, we can create a brighter future for all our families. And we'll see you again next Friday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Stay well.